The guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in August 1945, leaving behind a world irrevocably transformed. History had seen moments like this before. Following Napoleon's defeat in 1815, statesmen gathered at the Congress of Vienna to meticulously redraw borders and restore equilibrium to a shattered continent. A century later, in the wake of the First World War, the victorious powers convened at the Paris Peace Conference, driven by the hopeful intent to craft a treaty that would end all wars. Yet after 1945, history broke form. There was no grand single conference to rebuild the international order, no unified assembly of nations to chart a collective path forward. Instead, amid the smoking ruins of global conflict, a new reality crystallized with alarming speed. The shared wartime objective that had held fragile alliances together dissolved, giving way to a fierce new rivalry. Out of the ashes rose two colossal titans, the United States and the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, their competing visions for humanity collided, igniting the Cold War, an intense political, ideological, and military confrontation that would cast its long shadow over global politics for the next 4 decades. While the total collapse of the Axis powers in 1945 brought an end to the battlefield bloodshed, it did not heal the world's deepest divisions. At its core, the Cold War was never just a contest of weapons or territory, it was a battle of ideas. Since the 1930s, the global stage had been dominated by two radical competing visions for how human society should be organized: the revolutionary communism enforced by the Soviet Union and the authoritarian fascism and Nazism practiced by Italy and Germany. World War II thoroughly smashed fascism, purging its regimes and leaving its cities in ruins. Yet, destroying one adversary only exposed the profound rift that remained. The demise of the Axis powers did not resolve the fundamental ideological struggle over the future of society. It merely cleared the board, leaving communism to face its ultimate counterweight, Western democratic capitalism, in a world where only two superpowers were left standing. In its place, a stark new confrontation emerged. Communism, led by the Soviet Union, democratic capitalism, led by the United States. To millions living through the 1940s, these two systems were not merely different modes of government, they were fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Each side harbored a deep-seated conviction that the other posed an existential threat and had to be aggressively contained, if not outright defeated. In many ways, World War II had functioned like a total, almost religious war between rival belief systems. Once Nazi Germany was erased from the map, that intense ideological friction did not vanish. It simply realigned, zeroing in on the last two giants standing. Some historians argue that a clash between these titan nations was inevitable, given their irreconcilable political, economic, and philosophical foundations. Yet, while a baseline rivalry may have been predictable, the Cold War itself was not born in an abstract vacuum. Specific, volatile flashpoints transformed mutual suspicion into an enduring global standoff. And the most explosive early trigger of them all was Poland. Few nations in human history have suffered a more tragic geopolitical geography than Poland. Trapped on the vast northern European plain, its flat terrain, devoid of major mountain ranges or natural defenses, had for centuries made it an open highway for invading armies. For Russia, that same flat corridor was a recurring nightmare, serving as the primary invasion route for Napoleon, the Kaiser, and most recently, Hitler's devastating blitzkrieg. Driven by this history, Joseph Stalin was unyielding. The Soviet Union required absolute control over Poland to secure its western frontier. Never again, in Moscow's view, could Polish soil be used as a springboard to strike Russia. Yet this strategic imperative collided head-on with a fierce cultural reality. The Polish people, having spent centuries resisting foreign domination, harbored a deep historical resentment and profound fear of Russian power. To the Poles, Soviet protection felt less like security and far more like the return of an old, familiar oppressor. The scars of that shared history ran deep, forged over generations of bloodshed and subjugation. 19th century. Poland was erased from the map, its lands partitioned and ruled under the iron fist of the Russian Empire. 1918 to 1921. Having finally regained its independence in the chaotic wake of World War I, the fragile new Polish state immediately had to fight a brutal, desperate war against Soviet Russia to defend its newly won borders. 1939. The Soviet Union struck again, invading eastern Poland from behind under the secret terms of the infamous Nazi-Soviet Pact. 1944–1945. As the Red Army swept westward to push back the Germans, they returned not just as liberators, but as occupiers, killing, arresting, or deporting tens of thousands of anti-communist Polish resistance fighters. Given this grim, unbroken record of conflict, one truth was undeniable. The Polish people would never freely choose or accept a government controlled by Moscow. Stalin understood this reality all too well. Recognizing that a truly democratic Poland would inherently be hostile to Soviet interests, he arrived at a ruthless conclusion. Genuine Polish independence could not be permitted. If Poland was to serve as the USSR's permanent shield against future invasion, it had to be governed by a puppet communist regime, one entirely loyal to Moscow, backed by the full weight of Soviet military power. While Stalin remained adamant about controlling Poland, the Western Allies attached tremendous importance to the nation's fate, though for their own distinct reasons. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was acutely aware of the moral and political stakes. Britain had, after all, entered the war in 1939 specifically to honour its guarantee of Polish independence. Churchill knew he could never justify to his people or to history why Britain had fought to defeat Hitler only to stand by and watch Stalin impose a new totalitarian dictatorship over the very country they had set out to save. President Franklin D. Roosevelt championed Polish self-determination not only out of a commitment to post-war democratic principles, but also out of sharp political realism, quipping to Stalin at one point that he couldn't ignore the voice of the 1 million Polish-American voters residing in Chicago. By 1943, Poland had become the primary fault line between the Big Three. What began as quiet diplomatic disagreements soon escalated into a constant, grinding source of friction between the Western Allies and Moscow, a tension that only grew more intense, immediate, and irreconcilable as total victory over Nazi Germany drew near. As the war's final embers cooled, both Moscow and the Western capitals came to a sobering realization. The bitter struggle over Poland was not an isolated dispute, but merely the opening salvo in a much broader conflict over the future of Europe. By early 1946, the fragile unity of the wartime alliance had completely fractured. The Cold War was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived. The ideological battle lines were drawn sharply in February 1946, when Joseph Stalin addressed the Soviet nation in a major televised and radio broadcast. His tone was uncompromising. In a stark message to his people, Stalin declared that navigating relations with the capitalist United States and Great Britain was fundamentally no different than dealing with the fascist threat of Nazi Germany. The Soviet people had to brace themselves and prepare for an inevitable future conflict with the Western world. The USSR needed to dramatically mobilize its resources and strengthen the communist system to withstand what he framed as hostile capitalist encirclement. To Western observers, the speech sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. It sounded less like a post-war peace address and far more like a formal declaration of intent, a warning that the Soviet Union was actively preparing for the world's next great confrontation. Just 1 month after Stalin's ominous radio address, the Western world delivered its reply. In March 1946, President Harry S. Truman invited Winston Churchill, who despite losing the British premiership in 1945, remained an revered global statesman, to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Churchill did not pull his punches. Standing beside Truman, Churchill issued a dramatic historic warning that echoed across the globe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Churchill laid bare the reality on the ground. Behind that line, the historic capitals of Central and Eastern Europe were being systematically subjected to Moscow's control. He argued that unchecked Soviet expansionism posed an existential threat to global peace and human freedom. To prevent further aggression, he urged the United States and Great Britain to form a tight, unyielding alliance to resist Soviet pressure. hinting that the West should be prepared to leverage its nuclear monopoly if necessary to keep Moscow in check. It was a rhetorical bombshell. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech shattered any remaining illusions of a cozy post-war alliance, officially framing the rift for the global public. Today, it stands as the symbolic beginning of the Cold War. This new hostility was especially bitter because only a year earlier, in February 1945, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had gathered at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea. There, in the final months of the European War, they had solemnly pledged to cooperate in shaping the post-war order, promising free elections and democratic self-determination for liberated Europe. Yet, as the Red Army consolidated its grip on Poland and forced communist regimes into power across Eastern Europe, those high-minded promises were exposed as hollow compromises. The Western Allies felt betrayed by Stalin's aggressive land grab, while Stalin viewed Western interference in his buffer zone as a direct threat to Soviet security. The high hopes forged at Yalta dissolved almost immediately into deep-seated mutual suspicion, as each side read the other's defensive moves as aggressive provocations, uncompromising geopolitical rivalry, splitting Europe down the middle with fortified borders and proxy battle lines, and the opening salvos of a global struggle, a quiet yet dangerous confrontation that would endure, shape nations, and dictate world politics for more than 40 years.